Okay, I guess so. The strategy, the main strategy in checkmating with the king and queen is to force the king into onto the edge of the board because for example, if the king is on the edge of the board and you have another king, there's many ways to checkmate. For example, the queen can go in between the two kings, or the queen could do a back rank mate, uh, sort of a back rank type of mate. Uh, so to force the king onto the edge of the board, the main concept or the main thing you have to remember is that the queen kind of acts like well, the queen controls these two, uh, it can control, it creates a box of sorts. So you want to lower the box in order to checkmate with the king and queen. So for example, if the king goes onto d7, you move the queen to d6. Now the king can't go over the 6th rank or onto the b file, so it can't go past these lines. And then you gradually shrink this box until you get the king onto the edge of the board. And then, well, it's pretty simple to checkmate. You just move your king in front of the queen. I mean, move your king in front of your enemy king, and then checkmate. And of course, you want to prevent stalemate by moving the king onto the corner and then trapping it. So I guess so. Just how can white in this position shrink the box? So what's the move that white should do to shrink the box? Shrink this.
You can go to b6.
Not quite, because after b6, the king can go out of the box. So now the king goes on to like d5.
You can go to b5 then.
Yeah, so b5, now the box has shrunk. And I guess after, let's say, king e6, well, then what? How do you shrink the box?
Going to c5.
Yeah, c5. And I guess if the king goes onto f7, how can you shrink the box now?
Go to. You can go to e5.
Yeah, e5 shrinks the box. So you just repeat this process. But now, what if the king goes to g6? And now you can't really shrink the box anymore. Or actually, yeah, you can do that, but how can you do it? But you can't just you have so where can you move to shrink the box now?
Hmm. Oh,
So
you can go to F4.
yeah, so Queen F4. So even though it doesn't really look shrunk, because now the king can't go past the F rank, while before the king could potentially go onto the F rank. So you generally try to shrink the box in one direction towards the edge of the board, and eventually after the king, you trap the king onto the edge, all you have to do is just move the king and then checkmate. So that's how you checkmate with the king and queen. But now, how do you checkmate with the king and rook? Uh, you can't really do the same strategy anymore, because now if you try to shrink the box, the king attacks. And if you try to move, uh, if you try to, I guess, makes move your rook while still having a small box, well, now the king can attack the rook. So what you so this rook is undefended. It can be attacked from the diagonals. However, you can also defend it. So, for example, I guess if the rook goes onto onto c4, and then king d5, you defend the rook, and now the king has to move. So it can move on to, for example, e5. Well, now how does white shrink the box?
By going to D4.
Yeah, so rook d4. Um, and now, because your king is close to your rook, you don't have to worry um, about your rook being attacked by the king. But however, if the king, for example, moves onto d6, you can't really move rook c5 because the king will capture it. So instead, what you do is you bring your king closer to the king. So, for example, king d4. Now you can, if the king moves to, let's say, e6, now you can close the box again. And if the king goes on to d7, you just you do the same thing. You move the king towards the enemy king, and then eventually you're able to close the box, shrink the box even further. But then he gets to the edge of the board. Uh, so what can white do now to try and checkmate black?
Mm. 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 Move your king to a C8.
Do you mean rook ch?
Yeah.
Um, so that checks the king, but however, the king can now move on to the f7 square, and now it's off the edge of the board. So instead, you shrink the box even more. So now, so before, this was the size of the box, and now you shrink it. And then you repeat this process until you get the king onto the corner of the board. So then you just, all you have to do is move your king in front of your enemy king, in front of the enemy king. And then you checkmate the king on the back rank. So a king and rook checkmate, you basically try to move your king in opposition of the enemy king. So does anyone know what opposition is in an endgame? So the opposition in an endgame is when you move your king in front of the enemy king. So right now, if it's white to play, white can move the king to e5 and gain opposition. And what the opposition does is that now the king can't move upwards. It can't move onto it can't move onto these three squares. So if you have something like a rook, let's say you move your king here, because before, if you move your king to d5, the king will move to f6. And if you want the enemy king to move here, you don't want him to move upwards, away from the edge. So you move king e5, gaining opposition, and then you move the rook and create the box. And then, for example, here, what can white do to gain the opposition right now? So I guess in other words, how can white make it so that it's black to move and that the kings are facing each other? And remember that white doesn't have to move the king. White can move the rook as well. So what white does, white can do is to just move the rook. So for example, rook d4. Now white has the opposition, and black has to move the king, for example, to d7 or to f7. Let's see. Or actually, you don't have to do that even. You can just move the rook along this file. And then after the king, I guess, moves towards the rook, you can, so if the king goes here, then you can close the square again, or you can try to, let's see. So here it's white to move, and white tries to checkmate black. Well, I mean, anything's fine. White can move here, and trap the king, and then move down. So I guess that's opposition. So the next thing that I want to teach is the king and pawn endgame. So right now, let's say white has a pawn and black has a king. So can black, if it's black's turn to move, actually, let's say the king was here. If it was black's turn to move, how can black stop this pawn from promoting? I guess let's say that we have a king here. So how can what should black do to stop white to draw the position? What black should do in this position is to capture this pawn, or try to capture this pawn. So how can black do that right now? If it was black's turn to move, what should black do? What moves should black move to try and capture this pawn?
You can go to E5 first.
Yeah. So king e5 moves towards this pawn. And now, what if white tries to escape by moving the pawn to g6? What should black do now?
You go to F6.
Yeah. So after king f6, now this pawn, it can't run away anymore because then the king will take on g7. So if So in the end game, one of the important things that you have to do is to take your opponent's pawns, passed pawns. So this pawn is passed, and it wants to promote. So if you move the king towards the pawn, eventually, if you move your king, you want your king to capture this pawn because then it'll be a draw. So let's say, let's bring up this position. So right now in this position, what should black do to what should black do if it was black's turn to play?
Hmm. 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 I don't think the king can capture it.
Are you sure? Well then, how can black try to capture it?
Hmm. Oh, you can go to D6 first.
Yeah, and then after b7.
Uh, mm, mm. King. Hmm. 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 And how can hmm. Hmm.
So
C7?
yeah, so after king c7, even though white promotes, black can just take it immediately. Um, so basically, to capture a pawn that isn't defended, you want to try and move your king besides the pawn, because now it attacks the pawn and it also attacks the square in front of it. So after the pawn moves forwards, the king will capture it. Or you want your king to move in front of the pawn. So here the pawn can't move, and then you just capture it. And one of the concepts in a king and pawn endgame is the concept of the square. So if you have this position, like this position, depending on whose move it is, white can either win or draw. And why is that? Well, let's just see. So after, if it's white to move, the pawn moves to g6. Black tries to uh, move to d5. Black tries to move besides the pawn. Then white moves the pawn again, and black does the same thing. But then white promotes to a queen, and now white is winning. But if it was black to move, so here, if it was black's turn to move, black will move the king towards this pawn, and then the king will make it to besides the pawn, where then after the pawn promotes, the king will capture it. So one of the concepts in the endgame is the concept of the square. So as you can see, this is a square. And if the black king is inside of the square, even if it's white's turn to play, if the black king is inside of the square, then black can, if it's only the king and the pawn, the king can move towards the pawn and capture it. So for example, here, the king is inside the square, so you'll know that the king is going to capture this pawn, because after the pawn moves down, the king will be able to go beside it. So I guess right now, let's say we're in this position now. How can the king go inside of the square? Remember that the size of the square is how far the pawn is from promoting. So right now the pawn is, there's 3 squares right now from the pawn to the edge of the board. So therefore the square is 3 squares, wide. So after, so this is the shape of the square. So what should black do to get inside of the square?
It should go side. It should go to G6.
Yeah, so king G6. Now it's inside the square, and now and no matter what white does, this pawn will be captured. So, and there. So the next concept I want to talk about is whether or not to move the king or the pawn. So I guess, let's say we're in this position, like this one. The concept of the square is important, especially when you want to know if the king will be able to reach the pawn. So right now, it's white's turn to play, or actually it's black's turn to play. Let's say it's this position. So what should white do in this position? And remember that the king is inside of the pawn's square right now. So the pawn is, there's 4 squares between the pawn and the edge of the board. So therefore the square is 4 squares wide, 4 squares long. So now, as you can see, the king is inside of the square. So what should white do now? to try and promote this pawn. So right now, white has two options. White can either move the pawn to f6 or move the king. So if the pawn moves to f6, well, the king's inside of the square. So if white tries to promote, um, it'll turn into a draw. The black king will go beside the pawn and then capture it. So instead, you have to move this king. So what's one square? Where should white move in this position? Where should the king move right now if it was white's turn to play?
Should move. It should move to D6.
It's white's turn. It's white's turn to play. So, did you mean king d7?
Yeah.
Yeah. So after the king goes to d7, now even though black's king is inside of the square, um, uh, the white king will be defending this pawn. So, for example, let's say white moves to e7. Now, black can't capture this pawn after it moves to f6 because it's defended by the king. So what the square can do, what you can use the square to decide is whether or not you should just run your pawn down to the bottom, down to the promotion line, or whether you should move your pieces to protect this pawn before moving down. So the next lesson, I guess, is when the king is in front of the pawn. So let's say it was this position, like so, or even here. So what's one way for white to just, where can white move right now?
Okay.
So white can only really move the king in this position.
Yeah.
White moves. Well, white can really move. White wants to move the king in front of this pawn because what white wants to do right now is to promote this pawn into a queen and then get an easy king and queen checkmate. So what white does right now is to move the king to e6. Another thing that king e6 does is that it gains the opposition. So if the king moves to f6, the black king can go to d7. And if the king goes to d6, the black king can go to f7. So after king e6, then black moves the king onto f8. And let's say, so right now, how can white, I guess, guarantee a promotion? So where should white move right now to try and promote this pawn?
You can go to d7, the king.
Yeah, so the king goes to d7, and then uh, it doesn't matter what black does. So even if he moves king f7, then the pawn will just advance, and there's nothing black can do to prevent this pawn from going to e8, because these three squares are defended by the king. So if you are the one with the pawn, you want to try and move your king in front of your own pawn, and then you want to try and defend the squares in front of the pawn, and then move your pawn downwards. So right now, white promotes into a queen, and then it's an easy checkmate from there. So I guess another thing that there's something you have to watch out for if you're the one with the extra pawn, and that is getting your opponent's king in front of the pawn. So right now, it's black's turn to play. Well, it's white's turn to play, and white has an extra pawn. However, black's king has moved in front of the pawn. So what happens now is that this position is actually a draw, even though white has an extra pawn. So if the king goes to d4, the black king goes to e6. Then after e5, the black king goes down to e7. And not d7. Well, d7 also works because now if the king goes onto e8 after king d6 and king d8, if white tries to tries to push the pawn, then it'll be a stalemate. And white can't move this king away from the bottom of the board, because if the king tries to go away, then the black king will go forward in front of the pawn. And if white tries to move the king again, black will move the king down and move in front of this king again. So if you're the one who's down a pawn and you're black, what you want to do is get in front of your enemy, in front of the enemy pawn, and gain opposition against the enemy king. So for example here, if it's black, after black moves king d5, the white king can either move away, but then that allows black to move king e4, or white can advance the pawn, in which then you just move your king again, and eventually you'll reach the end of the board, where here, instead of moving your king onto d8 or f8, you move your king downwards onto e8, and after the king moves forwards, you gain opposition. So right now, it's 5:40, so this the beginner rapid is almost starting. So I guess I'll paste this into the chat, and you can join it, and if anyone else joins, you'll play against them. But otherwise, that's the end of the lesson for today.
Okay, bye.
Bye.